AI could help us in so many ways if we get it right. It could help us solve climate change. It could help us address inequities in the criminal justice system. It could help with us educate many, many more people with the standards, that students at a school like UH would get. It could really, really change things for the better.
Velina Mānoa I ka lehua aloha, aloha ua tuahine, mai lua hine a I Waikiki, kia I ke kahau kani, kani no na leo, e o kama aina, aina aloha e, Mānoa e. Ke lehi maila I ka ula o ke kai e, o ka mahalama lama o ni I hau ua mali e, a mali e pa, ke inu vaila, ke inu maila, na hala o na wai ke kai, no na we ka hala, no puna ka wahine, no ka lua no I kila we ai. Aloha.
Mahalo, Noelle, for that lovely ole and welcoming us here to the Hawaii Mānoa Valley. And mahalo for all of you that have joined us tonight. I'm Denise Konan. I'm an economist and I'm the Dean of the College of Social Sciences here at University of Hawaii at Mānoa. And this is just a very special occasion because this is the first in-person event that is part of the UH Better Tomorrow speaker series in the past 2 years. And we've all been through challenges this past time, and it is quite special that we've gathered here in person. I know that you're all here and feeling that as well, and I do want to also acknowledge that in addition to people who have come here tonight in person, we have many, many that are watching us online, and we welcome you all. Thank you so much for joining. And tonight really is about togetherness in a sense and new ways of coming together in this digital age, this way that technology is bridging divides is, even through the lockdown, just has been tremendous. And we've all adapted in incredible ways. And even as we're marveling through new apps that help us through these times, we know that it's really changing us as a society. In some ways, it's bringing us closer together. In some ways, there are divides and digital divides that may mislead us, may make it difficult. And lots of innovations that are happening in our lives in response to times like this. And so we're so fortunate that we are going to be able to, as a university like ours, take on some of these issues and discuss these issues here tonight. As the new technology shape the world, how can we best prepare our students for their lives in this new era that we are all still seeking to discover? So in events like this, it's just really wonderful to see that the Better Tomorrow speaker series is able to step in and provide insights for us. This is a joint venture of the University of Hawaii Mānoa, the Hawaii Community Foundation, Kamehameha Schools, and it's also something that many in the university are supporting. My college, College of Social Sciences, UHERO, the Scholars Strategy Network, and the William S. Richardson School of Law all participated to make tonight's events possible. And so I really want to thank you all for coming out. I want to especially thank our student staff who have worked really very, very hard. If you could stand up, those that have worked hard to make this event happen in the back. Thank you so much. And the bookstore, too, for those of you that were able to get a book here tonight. So the Better Tomorrow speaker series aspires to not just spotlight good ideas, but to help move us and nudge us forward in new areas. So we try to include, as we're planning, not just our faculty and students who are here tonight, but our public officials, and we're so grateful for that. I want to thank Michael Bruno, Provost, and acknowledge that he's joined us here this evening. And at this time, I'm very, very honored and pleased to introduce Lieutenant Governor Josh Green to the stage, who will be introducing our speaker. We're very honored because, actually, Josh, you introduced our last in-person event. Remember back in time 2 years ago, and we're so glad that you can be with us here this evening to introduce the speaker here tonight. We owe a heartfelt gratitude to you for all you've done for our state in leading us through these very, very challenging times, and we welcome you. I welcome you to the stage. Thank you so much, Dr. Green.
So we've begun to kiss again, though we are highly boosted as a population here on the stage. So thank you guys for welcoming me so warmly. Thank you for surviving COVID and for wrestling with what was obviously the toughest 2 years of our lives here in Hawaii. I feel a great honor to be able to be with you, and I hope it's okay, Denise, if I ask for just a brief, before we introduce our esteemed guest, who is really extraordinary, Kevin Roose, if we could just ask for a moment of silence to honor Paul Farmer, who was exceptional as a human being. Let's give him a round of applause. So we'll take a moment of silence for his passing. And he would doubtless scold us for being sad about anything as life goes on, and he promoted life for millions, and we promote wisdom tonight and thoughtful leadership for the democratic process of people guiding this world, this technology world. But I'm going to get into Kevin now, who is exceptional already. So yes, it was 2 years ago when we started the Better Tomorrow series with our last in-person speaker, Harvard psychologist Robert Waldinger. And it was this auditorium. So you're back here again, continuing that legacy. Tonight's a different talk. It's about the issues of momentous importance that we see shaping now our lives. We're talking about how we look at our screens, our relationships with a different world, and how apps bring us knowledge and how they impact what we do and how we're connected. It's a powerful technological question that we'll be able to hear about tonight from an expert. It affects our relationships, and our relationships have been perhaps clouded by a mask, and they've been behind closed doors. And so I'm happy to see the kind of this awareness come out tonight. Now let's talk a little bit about Kevin Roose. Kevin is a Quaker who was raised by Swarthmore parents, which is very important to me because I went to Swarthmore. No one knows what Swarthmore is because it's a tiny little college in the middle of nowhere outside of Pennsylvania. But it's not surprising to me to feel kind of the gentle nature that he has coming from those beginnings. I think you're going to see that reflected in his conversation tonight. He seems like just a genuinely good person. He's also here, he doesn't look like he's under duress, but he is expecting a baby boy, he and his wife, in the next 12 minutes. So let's give him a round of applause and pray they don't go into labor tonight. Back in California. But he will offer us thought about the practical recommendations on every level of action in this space. He will talk to us about educational institutions like ours and how we actually can benefit from broad-based liberal education in this climate, in this world. He went to Brown, which I think is inferior to Swarthmore in every way, mostly because my wife went there and my very famous uncle went there. And so we like to tease those brown folks, but when I see them come out and talk to us about these emerging technologies and liberal art things, I tease, of course, it's so wonderful to see the value continue to be placed on higher education and the social science and the humanities. And it brings us together. We saw our music director here tonight, and we see deans come to talk. So it becomes a special process when we get someone like Kevin Roose here. So all of the recommendations he offers us tonight, I assume will often be hopeful rather than dystopian, but I don't know what he'll come up with. We've had plenty of dystopia, so it has been tough, but I really am so pleased that we have someone of his prominence. He grew up in a small town in Ohio, wrote his first book as a sophomore in college, which is extremely impressive, produced a documentary series, hosted a podcast, which I'm still not sure exactly I understand how to use podcasts, but people are always telling me to do them, and has written 3 books already. He's lucid, he's witty, he's just thoughtful. He writes for the New York Times, which we all love, and we're really just so pleased to have you here, Kevin. So let's give him a round of applause and celebrate a scholar here with us in Hawaii.
Aloha. Thank you for the wonderful introduction, Lieutenant Governor. So happy to be here. This is a very exciting day for me for a few reasons, one of which, as Lieutenant Governor Green noted, my wife is somewhere between 37 and 38 weeks pregnant. She is in the danger zone. So fair warning, if my watch buzzes mid-sentence and I get the right text, I am out of here. And you guys are going to have to entertain yourselves tonight. Very exciting. It's our first kid. And my wife was bummed because she wanted to come with me here to Hawaii, one of her favorite places to visit. So if you all could do me a favor and just go on my Instagram and just comment about how awful the weather was. And, you can't believe it rained the whole time. And her husband definitely did not drink pina coladas on the beach instead of helping her set up the nursery. I'd really appreciate it. The second exciting thing about today is that it's in person. We are here in a building with each other. It is amazing. I've done so many events and all through Zoom, and this is way better already. I don't have to worry about whether I'm on mute before I start talking. If you all pick your noses, you can't turn off your cameras. I can see you, so we've got that going for us. And the third reason that I'm excited today is that I get to talk to you all. This such a great group of people. In my day job, I write for the New York Times, and that means effectively writing for everyone in the English-speaking world. Young people, old people, rich people, poor people, people who are tech experts, and people who got lost in the tech section on their way to Wordle. I talk to them all. But you are students and educators and leaders. You get it. I don't have to tell you that technology or the internet is important or that it's changing society or that you should be paying attention to it. You're not scared of the future. You've just been through a freaking pandemic, and so you are just wondering what is going to happen next and how you're going to get through it. So I thought we would just talk a little bit about that, and I'll share some things that I learned in the course of writing this book, and then we can have some questions and conversations. Now, I should say that my book, it's got this title, it makes it sound, it's got 9 rules in it, makes it sound like a self-help book, and I guess in some ways it kind of is, but I am not an advice writer. Self-help is not my thing. I am a tech columnist. I write about iPhones and social media apps and cryptocurrencies named after dogs. But I wrote this book, honestly, because of something that happened to me just after I graduated from college. So this was about a decade ago. I was in my first job in journalism, and I was a financial reporter. I was covering big banks. And one of the tasks that I had every quarter, when the companies would release their earnings reports, I would write them up. So, Morgan Stanley would say, we made $1.2 billion in profit this quarter. And I would go on the release and I would find the right numbers and I would put them into a story and I'd type it up real quick and I'd hit publish. And that was like part of my job. And it was not the most fun part, but it was an interesting experience and I learned a lot. And then one day I got an email from this company called Automated Insights. Automated Insights, what's that? Well, it's a software company in North Carolina, and they had just come up with a new AI reporting app. So I perked up and I said, well, what can this reporting app do? And they said, well, it can write corporate earnings stories. It can take data from press releases and plug it into a template and publish it with no human intervention required. And it could do all this in milliseconds. And they bragged in this email that their software had been used to produce 300 million stories in a single year, which is slightly more than I write. So I had a problem, obviously, which is that a piece of software was doing my job better and faster and more accurately than me. It was like, seeing someone who enrolls in your school who's like your exact body double, but also like is a Rhodes Scholar and the captain of the football team and a world-class musician and funnier and more personable than you, and he never sleeps. Of course, that's not what I told myself. I told myself, well, I'm not going to be automated. I have special skills. I'm irreplaceable. Surely there are things that I can do that the robots can't. This is an extremely common reaction. In fact, if you survey people in the US and you ask them the question, will robots displace large numbers of American workers in the next 10 years? About 75% of them say yes, they will. And then if you ask them, will robots displace you in the next 10 years? Only about 25% of people say yes. So we have this idea that AI and machine learning and robots can do enormously sophisticated things and are going to displace millions of people, create mass unemployment, but not for me. I'm special. And when I started reporting this book, I went back and I looked throughout history and I saw this same reaction happening for hundreds of years. When the first factory equipment arrived during the Industrial Revolution, there were people who said, oh, they will never have the je ne sais quoi that these human textile producers have. And we know what happened there. When the first computers were used to translate languages, all the human translators said, well, they will never be able to capture the nuances of translation. Now, we still have human interpreters, but Google Translate's getting pretty darn good. My favorite example of this was in 1984. The JFK Airport in New York introduced the first automated ticket machine, where you could go up and it was like you press a button, it's like a vending machine for airline tickets. And they wrote a story about this. They sent the reporter out and they sent him to interview a bunch of travel agents. And one of the travel agents gave this quote that I just love. He said, well, this will never catch on. What if you just press the wrong button? You end up going to a totally different city. He could not imagine a future in which people entrusted computers to purchase airline tickets. And yes, we do have travel agents still, but when was the last time you met one? So the problem that we have today, this displacement cycle has been happening for hundreds of years, but the problem today is that it is happening so quickly. In my book, I have tons of examples of machine learning apps that are doing incredible things that they couldn't do even 18 months or 2 years ago. There are now machine learning models that can diagnose certain types of cancer on scans much more accurately than even the best human radiologists. There are AIs that can spot issues in legal documents with much higher accuracy than even the best white shoe lawyers. There are even apps that are creating art and building video game levels and writing music that is indistinguishable and in some cases better than the analog human counterparts. And I could spend the rest of this talk tonight telling you about these AIs and what they're capable of doing and how it poses a threat to all kinds of people in their jobs. But there's a rule in journalism that says, show, don't tell. So I thought we could do a fun little demo and try to automate the job that I am doing right now. So I've been recently I've been playing around with this, something called GPT-3. Has anyone used GPT-3? GPT-3 is what's called a large language model. It's basically a super-powered AI that writes and analyzes text. So basically, if you can imagine the autocomplete feature on your iPhone, but then run it with one of the 5 biggest supercomputers in the world and feed trillions of examples through it and tell it to be able to learn how to write text in any number of styles. It has 285,000 CPU cores in it. So basically, the way it works is you put in some text and you say, complete this text, and it will write you more paragraphs in any style that you want to. You don't have to train it on different authors specifically. It has ingested basically the entire internet, and it can mimic almost any style. It's really good. It's so good, in fact, that OpenAI, the company that developed it, didn't release it to the public because they were worried it was too powerful and that it would be used to write, for example, ultra-realistic propaganda that would be indistinguishable from propaganda created by humans. So GPT-3 is not publicly available, but I did manage to get a little demo of it. There's a product called Pseudo-Write, which was developed by an AI engineer in San Francisco, and who was a frustrated sci-fi science fiction writer. And he was getting stuck, getting writer's block. And so he said, maybe GPT-3 could help. So the way it works is you plug in some text and you push this little button called wormhole, and it figures out the rest. And then you can say, I want that to sound more hopeful, or I want that to sound, grave, or I want it to sound whimsical, and it'll reshape the text to whatever you want. So this morning, I plugged some paragraphs from this speech into GPT-3, and I asked it to write me a paragraph about the subject of AI and automation that was suitable for delivery to this audience. So I'm just going to read you the output of the machine here. Automation and AI are the future, and we need to prepare for them. Automation and AI are not inherently evil, and we shouldn't fear them, and we shouldn't fight them. We need to let it enhance our lives, and we need to let it create new jobs so we can do more stimulating and entertaining things, because our lives are meant to be more than just work. Pretty good, pretty good. I'm sweating a little bit up here. And then, just to give it a challenge, I asked it to rewrite that paragraph in the style of William Shakespeare. So here's GPT-3 Shakespeare sounds like. O humanity, thou art bound to fall to thy doom. Thou shalt become slaves of the machines. They shall make thee toil endless hours. They shall not give thee leave to rest. Thou shalt toil evermore till thou shalt die. Whoa. And then just for fun, I asked it to write me a closing paragraph that sounded Hawaiian. That's the only instructions I gave it. I was a little unsure about whether it would be able to do it. So here's what it came up with. We need to bodyboard and surf and watch the blue sea glisten in the shimmering light. Ohana, the ocean shall provide for us. Pretty good. So there you have it. An AI can not only do my job right now, but it can be Shakespeare and it can be a Hawaiian poet. I am officially screwed. Next year, you don't even have to invite speakers. And what's fascinating about GPT-3 is that it's not just a threat to writers. The OpenAI, the company that developed it, last summer released a version called Codex. And what Codex does is essentially the same thing, but instead of producing paragraphs of text, it produces working code. So you can tell it, write me a JavaScript app that will display the price of Bitcoin in 20 different currencies with a green background and a little thing in the corner that tells me the weather. And it will build that on the spot. And this technology is very new, but it's improving very, very quickly. And a lot of these AIs out there in different fields are also improving very quickly, to the extent that some of the biggest and most prestigious firms in America think that we are on the precipice of a true crisis. McKinsey, the consulting firm, predicts that by the year 2030, 45 million Americans will lose their jobs because of automation. And contrary to sort of the popular narrative about this, it's not just going to be truck drivers and fast food workers. It will be doctors, bankers, consultants, musicians, journalists. In fact, there are some studies that have suggested that white-collar jobs are actually easier to automate than many blue-collar jobs. So you mentioned needing some optimism. That was officially the depressing part. This is the hopeful part. So the question for all of us then becomes, in this world of rapidly improving machine intelligence, what can we do that can't be replicated by machines? What is left for us? And figuring out the answer to this question is super important, because it's not just about like what we do to stay employed as adults. It's for students trying to figure out what skills to develop, what subjects to study, what internships and jobs to aim for. It's important for setting our goals and trying to figure out how we can be not just professionally successful, but happy and fulfilled in a world where we're competing with machines every day. When I started writing this book, I started by calling all of the AI experts I knew, people in tech companies and government, people in research labs, and I asked them, what advice would you give to someone like me who is worried about being replaced by a machine? And what I thought they would say is that I needed to learn how to code, basically. I needed to go back to school and major in a STEM subject. I needed to hustle. I needed to optimize my life to become as efficient as possible and hyper-productive. But instead, they kind of surprised me because they said essentially the opposite. They told me that they would advise that person, me, to focus on deeply human skills, the kind that can't be automated. And then I asked the next follow-up question, which was, well, what are those skills? What can't be automated? Where do humans have a natural advantage? And they gave me 3 answers. The first is what I call surprising work. AI and computers in general, they really like regularity and rules. They're very good at doing repetitive, structured tasks. But they're very bad at what's called zero-shot learning. They don't like thinking on the fly. They don't like encountering new situations when they've never seen these kinds of things before, or an environment where the rules are constantly changing. Like, this is why AI is very good at playing chess, for example, because chess is the same game every time. It's a bounded board. It can practice over and over and over again, millions of times, getting a little bit better each time. But if you asked an AI to teach a kindergarten class, it would fail miserably, because that is a job that is all surprises and chaos. There's a famous experiment in computer science where programmers created this algorithm that could identify household objects in photographs. So you'd feed it a picture of a living room, and it would say, that's a coffee cup, that's a TV, that's a chair, and so on. And this algorithm got really good. It was above 95% accuracy on identifying household objects. And then they did something, they gave it a twist. They introduced a photo of a living room with a baby elephant in it. And they asked the computer to analyze it and label the objects. And the computer basically had a nervous breakdown. It not only couldn't identify the baby elephant, but it forgot the labels for most of what else was in the room. It could not process the context of a baby elephant appearing in someone's living room. It was unable to cope with that surprise. Machines hate surprises. So that work, the work that involves surprises and chaos and changing environments, that's where we have an advantage. Another area where we have a natural advantage is what I call social work. And this is work that basically, instead of making things, you're making people feel things. You're creating experiences and connections and emotions. The value of social work is based on meeting social and emotional needs rather than material needs. So obviously this would include jobs like therapists and nurses and teachers, but it also includes things that you wouldn't necessarily think of as social jobs. One example that I wrote about in my book is my accountant. This guy named Russ, he does my taxes every year. Actually, I'm late to call him this year. And he is in a field that is highly prone to automation. In fact, some studies have suggested that tax accounting is literally the single most automatable job in the world because of TurboTax and everything else. And Russ is a pretty good accountant, but the reason that he's survived is not because he's good at doing taxes. It's because he's a former stand-up comedian. Before he got into accounting, he wrote comedy, he performed comedy. He hires other comedians and pays for them to get their accounting degrees, and he has built a firm of extremely funny accountants. People do not believe me when I say that I enjoy doing my taxes, but it is true. I have more fun itemizing my deductions with Russ than I have had at actual comedy shows that I've paid money to see. And I asked Russ, why did you do this? Why did you hire a bunch of comedians and train them to be accountants? Why wouldn't you just hire accountants? And he said, because we're not selling accounting. We're selling the feeling that comes with having someone who is competent and personable and trustworthy help you manage your money. We are solving a human need rather than a material need. And just by giving that little twist to his outlook, he has managed to escape the robot apocalypse. The third category of work that is protected, or relatively protected, is what I call scarce work. And scarce work doesn't mean that there are only a few of these jobs. In fact, I think there are quite a lot. But they're jobs that require sort of rare skills or combinations of skills, activities that are high stakes or dangerous to automate, jobs with a low fault tolerance. So, for example, today, if you call 911 to report an emergency, a human picks up. Why is that? It's not because we don't have the technology to automate that job. We have automated phone trees. You could get a system that says, this is the police, press 1 to report a burglary, press 2 to report, some other crime. But we've decided collectively as a society that job is too important to automate. We don't want to fumble through a menu. We don't want to press 0 to talk to a representative. Something's going wrong if we're calling 911. And we have decided that we need someone on the other end of the line who can understand, contextualize, and respond to our needs right there and then. A less morbid example of a scarce job is my colleague, Will Shorts, who is the New York Times' in-house cruciverbalist. Anyone know what a cruciverbalist is? He edits the crossword puzzle. And a fun fact about Will Shorts is that he is the only person in the world who has gotten a college degree in enigmatology, which is the study of puzzles. He's a huge nerd. And because he's been doing this for his whole career, he has written and edited thousands and thousands of crossword puzzles, encyclopedic knowledge of the entire world of crossword puzzles. If you took him out in a comet, a comet took him out, I don't know how he would go on as a paper. He is literally irreplaceable because he's managed to develop an extremely specific skill and develop it at a high level. And so if you put these categories together, surprising, social, and scarce, you start to get an idea of what kinds of people are well equipped to survive this technological transformation. They're the kinds of people with empathy and emotional intelligence, the kinds who are good at reading a room and meeting people where they are, figuring out how someone is feeling and responding appropriately. They're people who make experiences rather than things. They're people who follow their passions, no matter how esoteric or crazy they sound. They're people with moral courage, people who are cool in a crisis, who can handle surprises, and people who, when presented with a challenge, like, for example, going to school in the middle of a pandemic, embrace that challenge and figure out the best way through it. For years, those skills, these deeply human skills that make us stand out in a world full of intelligent AIs, have gotten a bad rap. We called them soft skills. I hate that term. We taught students that the only people with job prospects, the only people who would end up succeeding and having stable careers were coders and engineers. But I'm confident that that is wrong, that is almost exactly backwards, because I live with those coders. I live in the Bay Area. I know tech executives. They're some of my friends. And that's not how they're raising their kids. Their kids go to the Waldorf school, where they play with blocks in the dirt, and they have no access to screens at all. Their kids are being taught that emotional intelligence and empathy are the skills of the future, the ones that they will need to succeed in a highly automated economy. And I think they may know something that the rest of us don't. They know that the world is changing and that the jobs that they trained for aren't necessarily going to be around 10 or 20 years from now. They know that even the programmers, who have still pretty good job prospects right now, will face the same kinds of challenges as people in other fields. And that what will be left for us after the GPT-3s of the world have their way with us is the human work. So I want to share just a few thoughts about that human work before we wrap up tonight. And these are things that I came across in the process of reporting this book that I think can help us understand more of the how we transition to an economy and a society that values human work appropriately. And the first is that I think we need to radically humanize our educational system. You'll often hear people in the humanities talking about how it's a moral responsibility to give young people an access to a liberal arts education, which you can agree or disagree with that, but forget morals for a second. I'm talking about the fact that it is a strategic advantage for young people to learn the skills, the deeply human skills that will help them stand out in today's job market. And this doesn't necessarily mean that everyone needs to drop out of STEM programs and become a philosophy major. We need those technical skills too. Those are super, super important. But we need to layer onto them a level of human ability and connection that will allow those people to thrive in the future. The coder, the sort of stereotype of the coder who sits in a dark room by his or herself pecking out code in isolation, that is going away. What is needed are the people who can both code and lead a team and collaborate and come up with creative new products. And you're starting to see more people in Silicon Valley acknowledge this, that we may have made a mistake in placing so much importance, so much priority on these sort of quote unquote hard skills and letting these quote unquote soft skills kind of erode. Jack Dorsey, the founder of Twitter, recently said that if he could build Twitter all over again, some of the first people he would have hired would be a behavioral economist and a game theorist. Because they had a bunch of engineers, they built this thing, and then the world got its hands on it and did things that they never predicted or expected. And he said having a behavioral economist and a game theorist on staff would have helped us anticipate how our service could be misused or what incentives might get people to have healthier conversations on Twitter. I hear from CEOs in tech almost every day who say things like, I have all the engineers I need, but I can't hire people who can close a sale or write a persuasive memo or win the trust of a client. Humanizing our educational system doesn't mean eliminating science or technology from our curriculum. We need that badly, but we also need these other skills. And there are some interesting experiments happening with this around the country. A lot of medical schools are now teaching classes in medical communication. There's a program called OncoTalk that just teaches medical students how to talk about cancer. Not how to diagnose it, not how to treat it, but just how to talk to people with cancer near the end of their life in a compassionate way. That's not a skill that we taught in med schools for a long time, but now we're starting to. Stanford now has an Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence, where they talk not only about how to build AI, but how to use it to improve human lives. There are courses that are jointly taught by philosophers and computer scientists. The University of Texas at Austin just introduced a course called Ethical Foundations of Computer Science, which is basically a course that even before you start studying computer science, you start with the ethics, why you're building what you're building. My second thought is that we need to make efficiency a dirty word in our society. Has anyone ever complimented you on being efficient? It kind of stings, doesn't it? Like if I passed out surveys after this talk and asked you all what you thought of my speech and you said that it was efficient, I think I would be pretty depressed about that. Not because I want to waste your time or like spend a bunch of extra time saying things that you don't need to hear, but because what you're here for is not efficiency. Efficiency is a code word that means machine-like. Machines are supposed to be efficient, but humans aren't. We're supposed to wander and dawdle and have epiphanies while walking through the park. We're supposed to be alive and creative. We're not supposed to be robots stamping out parts in a factory. The most important things in life, like climbing mountains and running marathons or having children, are not efficient at all. And that's why they're meaningful. And when we try to make something more efficient, like Amazon trying to get a package to you in 1 day instead of 2, we often mean stripping the humanity out of it, treating the humans involved more like robots. There's a principle in social psychology called the effort heuristic. And the effort heuristic says, basically, I'm paraphrasing here, that the harder we think someone worked on something, the more we appreciate it. They've run studies, for example, where they take 2 groups and they give them identical bags of candy. And on one group's bag, they have a tag on it, on the bag, that says, "This candy was personally selected for you by John," or whoever. The other group has no tag on their bag. And they have them eat the candy and review the candy. And far and away, the group with the little tag on their candy reports that it's tastier. They like it more. They feel like someone selected it personally for them, and that actually improves the subjective experience of eating the candy. So this principle is now everywhere in our economy. We see this everywhere. We see this in art. We see this in entertainment. We see this in influencers and online culture. The effort heuristic is behind so many of the things that we pay money for, whether it's a farm-to-table restaurant that comes out and explains, this kale was picked from the rooftop garden, or they tell you a story about it, because what you're paying for is not actually the kale, it's the effort that it took to get that kale onto your plate. So I think efficiency is the opposite of the effort heuristic. Efficiency would say what is quick is good, and the effort heuristic would say what somebody worked on hard is good. I got this idea. This idea came to me after I was watching a talk by the head of AI research at Facebook, now Meta, who was using the example of a DVD player and a ceramic bowl. And he said a DVD player is all made by robots. It has lasers and stuff in it. It's a complicated piece of machinery, but because it's entirely built by robots, it's pretty cheap. You can buy one for like $50. But a ceramic bowl, if you want a good one, that's going to cost you a lot more than $50. And that is a technology that has been around for thousands of years. Because what you're paying for is the artisan. You're paying for the time and the expertise and the labor. So I think what I'm saying by we should make efficiency a dirty word in our society is not that everyone should lollygag or that we should all blow our deadlines and not get any work done. But I am saying that I think a good shortcut to figuring out if something is deeply human or not is to consider whether or not it's efficient. And I think we also need a radical change in the way that we think about and measure our human efficiency. We have today a whole framework around efficiency that, gross domestic product and economic productivity, we assume that the more gets done in a short time, the better off we are. But in this new economy that we're moving into, this AI economy, we need to start measuring our accomplishments in other ways. The final thought I want to leave you with tonight, and then we'll open it up to questions, is something that a friend of mine who's an AI engineer told me after this book came out. We were taking a walk in Oakland, where I live, and he said, humans should really get better at distributed intelligence. I said, go on. He said, well, the way that AI learns is that there are all these nodes in a network. And once one node in the network figures out something, it passes it back to all the other nodes. So this is why, for example, every self-driving car doesn't need to independently learn what a motorcycle looks like. Once one of them learns, it sends it back to the machine learning model, and that teaches all the other ones. They learn together as a group. That's what distributed intelligence looks like. But humans don't really do that very well. We hoard information. We silo it away in, schools and programs. We don't do an awfully good job of sharing what we learn with others. And I think we really need to change that, because they're all performing on one team, and we are many different teams. So I guess my suggestion I want to leave you with, as we all inch back out into this IRL world, into this long period of isolation, is to really share with each other. Like, if you learn something cool, tell it to someone else. Like, build a friendship, share a book recommendation, mentor someone at work or at school, because we are not going to stay ahead of the machines alone. We can only do it together. Thank you. So the question, if you couldn't hear or you're watching remotely, was about GPT-3, this AI writing tool, and how you can use it to write your term papers, and also what writers and teachers of writers need to tell them about whether it's still useful to learn how to write. I sure hope it's still useful to learn how to write, because if it's not, I am going to be having a great time as a barista for the rest of my career. I think what computers can do, and it's very telling that the way this works is that you feed it an idea and it finishes it. Computers aren't very good at coming up with ideas. So I think there will be a future in which writers and AIs work together, and say, writer comes up with an idea and writes a little bit of it, and then there's sort of a handoff at some point. I actually wrote a review for the New York Times Book Review using this tool a few weeks ago. Which was a grand experiment, and it was we disclosed it in the paper that this was written by a robot partially, but it was I would like to think that it wasn't quite as good as me, but it was passable, and so I think there will be certain types of writing that will be automated, but there will still be such a need for persuasive communication in every field. I mean, this is maybe the thing I hear most from executives. They ask me which writers they should hire, because they're these big executives at billion-dollar tech companies, and they need people in their companies who can write persuasively. And if they could use AI to do it, they would be using AI to do it. But they need the human touch. So I think it's still worthwhile.
The next question is also about education. What did the pandemic teach us about education?
I mean, you all are much more qualified than I am to answer that question. My impression from having friends who are educators and friends with children who have been educated through this pandemic is that there are a lot of things that just don't really work over a distance. So much of the classroom experience is the moments between lessons, the sort of reading the body language of the student who wants to pipe up but is a little bit afraid, encouraging collaboration in the classroom. These things are, teachers and educators have been heroes throughout this pandemic at finding ways to adapt, but we know that it's not a perfect substitute. I mean, all the research shows us that it's not a perfect substitute, and that something, and potentially a lot, is lost when you go virtual. So I think that educators, the great ones, are not just transferring knowledge. That's not a big part of their job at all, actually, is like, I know something and now I'm going to tell you that something. It's a complex emotional relationship. And that's really, really hard to capture over Zoom.
Do you think it's possible to humanize education through Zoom?
It's certainly possible to make it more human. And I think teachers and educators of all kinds have been really creative about finding ways to adapt to that format. But it's hard. There are some natural limitations of that model. So I don't think it's going to solve everything.
Next question is, I'm a principal at a school. I just got hired at Google. Should I take it?
Wow, how much are they paying you? No, I don't know. I think it depends on what the job is. It depends, what you'd be doing if you feel like you'd be having. It depends what your life circumstances are like, and I'm never very good at career advice because my answer is always kind of like it depends. But I have a huge admiration for educators.
Who should be making the big decisions about technology and how?
The big decisions about technology, and that includes so much. I think what we're seeing now is some of the consequences of letting companies make all of the decisions about technology. I think that in past technological revolutions, what you've seen is a lot more public sector involvement. In the early 20th century, as in the sort of so-called second industrial revolution, the U.S. government took an extremely active role in developing and electrifying parts of the country. They went around to rural towns and turned on the lights, and it was just a huge public works project. And the internet was really a public sector project. So I think the public sector has been kind of sleeping at the wheel and has not really known how to sort of get its arms around some of these problems. And I don't think that's a failure of any individual politician, but I do think we need to start seeing more democratic participation in this process, because what we've seen now is essentially these massive, supranational corporations that have billions of users that kind of act like governments, but they're not, and they're not accountable like governments are. And so I think we need to insert the democratic process in.
How has reporting on tech changed since the early 2000s? With companies like Facebook or other platforms catering information, has the method of reporting changed?
Well, I was in high school in the 2000s, so I wasn't a tech reporter yet. But I think it's gotten, in some ways, much easier, and in some ways, much harder. So, I have access as a reporter to communities and pieces of information and people that I never would have had before. I can look people up. It's, LinkedIn is a great reporting tool. In the old days, like if I wanted to contact, 100 employees of Google, I would have to look in the phone book or something. And now I can just go on LinkedIn and say these 100 people I'm going to send messages to. So that part of it has gotten easier. Another place where I really appreciate AI in my daily job is transcription. So when I was a reporter, when I was a young reporter, I had to transcribe all my own interviews, and it was the least favorite part of my job, because you'd have a 2-hour interview and then you'd sit there for 6 hours typing up the notes from the tape, and now AI just does that instantaneously. So that's something that I really appreciate.
Do you think AI could free us from labor?
Do I think AI could free us from labor? It's possible. That was the sort of, John Maynard Keynes had this, it was an economist, had this sort of famous essay about how, in the future we'd all be working, much, much less than we do now. I think 20 hours a week, and we'd spend all our free time making art and doing, philosophizing and spending time with our families. And there's a book that came out a few years ago with a funny title called Fully Automated Luxury Communism. And it's a book about basically this, a world in which we are essentially freed from the burden of labor. And that we have everything we need because the robots make all of our food and give us all of our material goods. I think a lot of people like to labor, as much as we as much as we sort of overwork people, and as much as we should all have a more balanced life. I don't know that this has been my sort of contention. Andrew Yang is a friend of mine, and we've argued about this. He thinks, give everyone universal basic income, and I think there's a lot of merit to that. But I also think that people some people genuinely like to work. They find purpose in it. They find a sense of self and community. So I don't know that I think it would free us from certain types of labor, but I don't think people will ever stop working.
This question reads, I appreciate and agree with your idea of humanizing education and promoting deeply human traits. But what do you think about these approaches quickly getting capitalized or otherwise abused? Example, the ethics of computer science course being seen as an annoying requirement or just a cool way to boost your resume.
It's certainly possible. I think educators who are doing these kinds of courses need to be good at it and need to be compelling and need to make it interesting so that it's not just a chore. But I think a lot of this is being sort of driven by students. I think students want to learn this stuff. They feel kind of gross about the way that technology has kind of captured their attention and sort of manipulated their tastes and their habits. So I think a lot of it's being driven by students. But I think capture of these kinds of programs is certainly possible. So I think educators just need to be vigilant about making sure that it's like not just seen as like the boring thing that you have to do to get your degree, but is actually something interesting.
Does AI risk perpetuating racism by relying on historical predistinctions to determine outcomes? And how do we assure ethical use of AI?
Yes, is the answer to the first part of that question. It's pretty well documented now. A lot of AI systems are just horribly racist. They mislabel African American faces as animals. They can't tell apart members of various minority groups. My colleague Kashmir Hill wrote an amazing story a year or two ago about a black man who was arrested for a crime that he didn't commit because a facial recognition database had mistakenly identified him as someone else. This kind of thing is happening at scale all over the country. It disproportionately affects the poor. A number of states are now using AI to do things like determine benefits eligibility, who's eligible for food assistance, who's eligible for public housing. And when that goes wrong, like that has real consequences for people's lives. So these systems need to be better, and the states and jurisdictions that are implementing them need to really, really do their homework before they start turning stuff over to AI.
This is our final question. What is your optimistic and ideal vision for our future?
Fully automated luxury communism. No. No, I mean, I am actually quite optimistic, and what makes me optimistic is honestly like doing things like this, talking to students. I think there's a great magazine called Kernel that I just started getting. It's written by these young technologists. And it's sort of like an old school zine, if you remember zines. It's probably got 400 subscribers or something, but I get it sent to me. I love it. And every time I pick it up, it makes me feel optimistic because the young technologists are really thinking about this stuff and they're really good. And I just can't wait till they're running all the tech companies. And so I think I am optimistic. I think a vision of the future, I mean, AI could help us in so many ways if we get it right. It could help us solve climate change. It could help us address inequities in the criminal justice system. It could help with us educate many, many more people with the standards, that's students at a school like UH would get. It could really, really change things for the better. I mean, already, I do an annual column called the Good Tech Awards, where I find a handful of things that make me feel optimistic. This is like my attempt at keeping myself sunny and optimistic. So I find a couple things every year, and one of the things I wrote about this year was this project at Google, at a subsidiary of theirs called DeepMind, where they basically solved a protein folding problem using AI. Protein folding is this notoriously hard thing that has boggled the top, cellular biologists for ages, and they trained a computer to do it, and they solved it. And now those solutions are being used to develop hundreds of new drugs. The mRNA vaccine is a freaking miracle of science and technological progress. So that stuff makes me super optimistic, and I think that's something that I need to do a good job of keeping in mind.
Thank you all so much. Thanks for submitting questions. Kevin, thank you for speaking and for being here.
Thank you all for coming out. Thank you.